Think about the best leader you've ever worked with. Now think about the worst. And what was the difference? The best knew how to lead under pressure, while the worst crumbled. Leadership isn't just about luck. It's about having the right tools. And that's exactly what we teach at MPWR Coaching.
Whoo, I would say most leaders can be great leaders when everything is going well. Wouldn't you, typically speaking, wouldn't you agree, Eric?
Absolutely.
It's not until the pressure starts to pile on that we start to really see what leaders are made of, what makes the difference between good leaders and bad leaders. And the interesting thing is, no leader ever sets out to be a bad leader.
Yeah.
That's not anybody's goal. In fact, most leaders are trying to learn, grow with conferences, podcasts, expert advice. Why is it, though, that none of that seems to stick for leaders? It's like they want to get better, but all of this advice is not sticking to the wall.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I can speak out of the overflow of my experience and having worked with a lot of leaders, they've had a similar experience, right? I remember when I was younger and I first got into the conversation around leadership because I wanted to become a better leader. I read all the books and started listening to podcasts and going to conferences. And yeah, I often experienced there was a significant gap between the theory, the academic, the ideas that I was learning, and the ability to actually integrate those ideas into my everyday life.
Yeah.
And so I think for a lot of people, we're inspired, whether it's through some wonderful leadership saying on Instagram or on TikTok or whatever. We read a good book and we're excited, we're inspired. But inspiration doesn't necessarily lead to transformation. And so I think we started our coaching business really with the expressed purpose of bridging the gap between great leadership content or ideas and the practical daily how do I integrate this into my activities.
Absolutely. And would you agree that there's many things that make leadership difficult? One of them is often that people get promoted to their level of incompetence, let's say. So they
Yeah.
were a great salesperson, and then somebody's, hey, you should then lead the sales team, but nobody ever taught them how to lead. Somebody along the way taught them how to sell, but nobody ever taught them how to lead. And so then they're lacking these fundamental frameworks of what to do when things get tough.
Yeah.
Have you talk to me about that a little bit?
Yeah. I'm often struck by the fact that I went through so many years of kind of the traditional schooling system, right? I went through college. I did a master's degree. I actually did a master's in part of my study was in organizational leadership. And here's what's interesting to me. If we understand leadership not as a title and a position within a company, but as a measure of our influence and impact in any environment, like, can you remember taking a leadership class through elementary, middle school, high school, even through college? One of the most fundamental activities that we're engaged with every single day, every time we interact with another human being, we are practicing leadership for better and for worse. And yet there is no classic training or traditional training in our school systems. And so I think for a lot of people, what we find is number one, leadership is positioned as, once you achieve a role and responsibility within a company, you're a leader.
Mhm.
And so we miss out on the fact that every day we're leading in every area of our life. But also, I think for most people, because they've not had much training, we're trying to catch up. Like we're behind the eight ball once we find ourselves in those roles and responsibilities that are traditionally thought as leadership positions. And at that point, man, we have a lot to catch up on, and we normally feel overwhelmed, undergunned, really ill-equipped. And so, I've told you this many times. One of my passions is to change that, to say, how do we begin to integrate leadership training and engagement and to equip young people with the tools that will serve them not once they become a leader in an organization, but in the leadership responsibilities they have every single day of their life.
I will even add that in my master's degree, which was about how to go in and lead organizations, really, they didn't actually teach the nuts and bolts of how to be a good leader,
Right.
which is shocking. So, what's at stake, would you say, for these individuals? I know for me personally, when I first got into leadership, I felt like the emperor with no clothes. And so that right away put me in a position of feeling vulnerable.
Yeah.
And leadership is already hard and vulnerable enough. But when you don't feel like you are equipped to lead, what's at stake for our leaders and for our organizations?
Yeah, a popular phrase that has hit the scene over the last number of years is this phrase people refer to as imposter syndrome. And I think most people, as they step into greater responsibility, overseeing teams and having direct reports and whatever, even if you start a company, a lot of young entrepreneurs suffer from imposter syndrome. And in many ways, they should, right? Because we feel like an imposter, because we feel ill equipped, we feel inexperienced. And by the way, anytime we're learning anything new, we should probably feel a little bit of,
We are inexperienced and eloquent.
we are. So we should have a little bit of the imposter syndrome. I think the imposter syndrome is actually appropriate and healthy in those early stages. And yet, I think what's at stake, here's what I've seen more often than anything else, that people are promoted to various roles as leaders within a company. And then the fear of being found out for not being able to lead well is largely tied to a fear of being disqualified. If I can't prove that I'm a good enough leader, then I'm going to lose my job. I'm going to lose my promotion. I'm going to lose my paycheck. And sadly, most companies that I've worked with, the scales are so far tipped toward what we're trying to deliver in terms of product, services, whatever we're selling, that the scales, the time, energy, and money invested in making sure that we can make a buck is so far outweighed towards that versus development, right? And so in very few companies I've ever worked with have really intentional, developed programs to train and to equip people toward leadership. And we're not just talking about how do you run a meeting and how do you provide performance reviews and how do you determine whether someone should get a promotion or a bonus. We're talking about the day-to-day interactions between that leader and their people, their team. Like, how do we get the best out of our teams? How do we understand how they're wired? How do we engage with them in such a way that they feel safe and secure to make mistakes so that they can actually grow and develop? And so, the whole idea of leadership development is woefully anemic within most organizational cultures.
Yeah.
That's either something that we can boo-hoo over and beat ourselves up. That's one option. We can ignore it and hope things get better by accident.
Which
That's another option.
have we ever seen that?
A few times. Or we can just simply recognize, gosh, you know what? We probably need to invest a little bit more time, energy, and resource into figuring out how can we create a leadership culture, a culture where people are intentionally being trained, developed, they're being equipped with different tools and skills so that they can bring a better version of themselves to the workplace more often, and that their influence and impact is seen more as an asset than a liability.
Absolutely. Which that's at the core of what we are doing at Empower. It's at the definitely something that you are incredibly passionate about, which is how do we actually equip leaders with not just ideas, but
Yeah.
practical tools that are going to move the needle for them and their teams. That is why we have developed the leadership operating system, why you have developed the leadership operating system. Talk to us a little bit about how the leadership operating system can really change the game for leaders who are in the trenches, just trying to make it through every day, every week with their team.
It's interesting that metaphor around an operating system, right? We all know we love our smartphone devices or our tablets and computers. And I think most of us experience our devices through an interaction with the applications and sometimes miss the fact that the real genius behind these devices is the operating system, which is like the parental or governing software programs that actually make sure that the device works, that we have access to the apps, that they run appropriately, that they are sharing memory and power usage, that they don't crash all the time. And in many ways, we as human beings, I think oftentimes forget that we have all through our lives developed our own personal operating system. In other words, the prevailing attitudes and behaviors that govern the way that we engage, respond to any situation in life.
Right.
And some of the operating system that we've inherited from parents, family, extended family, friends, school, teams, coaches, whatever, some of the operating system that we've inherited or that we've developed or acquired over the years for ourselves is actually helpful.
Mhm.
And so it actually empowers us to understand the world we're operating in and to make decisions and respond in ways that are helpful to the environment. And some of the operating system that we've inherited or acquired over the years has been unhelpful. So, for example, my dad's an amazing man and he's a very transformed person today. But when we were growing up, he had a really terrible temper. And his way of controlling the environment when one of the five of four, my other four siblings, when we were acting out and being a little crazy, was to overpower the situation, to yell, to raise his voice, to use physical intimidation, none of which he does anymore. But I learned that. So when I was first raising my kids who are now adults, but when they were little, that's what I inherited. Like when they were acting out, the only way I knew to control the environment, right? The code that I knew how to run was yell, be aggressive, be physically intimidating, and scare the crap out of them until they behaved in an appropriate way. Well, what I found was I was running a part of my operating system that was actually leading to greater damage and was leading to terrible consequences, of which thankfully I was able to upgrade my personal operating system through a lot of coaching, counseling. Thank God for my wife, who was very patient with me in those earlier years. But that's our journey as human beings. We've inherited or acquired an operating system, but we've got to do the work to continually upgrade our operating system. And so all I've done was spend years under other mentors, leaning on and standing on the shoulders of people much smarter than me and taking all of the best core leadership principles and practices and saying, if we could distill these down into a set of simple visual tools that represented the very core of, if I'm going to bring the best version of me, whoever I am, doesn't matter, to the situation, then I need an operating system that can help me navigate the complexities of the world I'm operating in, the pressures that I'm constantly under, and help me determine the best way to respond in any given situation. That's what an operating system does for advice. And so I simply started calling it a leadership operating system, so that in all of the different applications that we're trying to run every day, like running meetings and working on projects and selling something and
Like
whatever
new
it is that we're
products, yeah.
doing, those are all applications. Every day we're running these applications. The problem is if we're not paying attention to our internal operating system, if we're not upgrading that operating system, then we're bound to be operating in ways that are dysfunctional, toxic, harmful, both to ourselves and to the people around us. And so for that reason, we're constantly inviting leaders to say, it's time to upgrade your leadership operating system so that you can lead yourself and your environment far more effectively.
And I love this metaphor because we all have the experience on our phones where we had an app that was working perfectly for an extended period of time. It always worked. It worked great. And then all of a sudden, what happened? The operating system changed or upgraded, but you didn't upgrade the app to match the operating system or vice versa.
Yeah.
And now all of a sudden things are falling apart. And the same is true in our own lives. Like for a lot of my life, I operated as a people pleaser. And then I got to a point in my life where I was still running this old operating system and the new apps would not cooperate with the old way of being. And
Right.
I had to do the work to do that personal operating system upgrade so that I could continue growing. We all have those parents or grandparents who has the original iPhone.
Oh yeah.
Constantly frustrated because they can't get things to work properly. And you're like, yeah, because your phone literally is so old that it won't run the new operating system. So nothing is going to work for you.
Well, for you, it may have been people pleasing. For me, it was getting married and realizing, wow, my operating system is not giving me the best results. Like the way I handle my anger, the way that I view failure, the way that I want to resolve conflict, the way that I want to make decisions, my view of money, my view of myself. And then as we had kids and as a parent, I realized, oh my gosh, my operating system is not delivering my ability to engage either my spouse, my kids, friends, coworkers in ways that was really beneficial. And again, I tell leaders all the time, in the same way that our phones naturally nowadays, they just automatically update the operating system at night while we're sleeping. For us, it takes a little bit of work, but the work is so incredibly worth it because as we upgrade our operating system, we find that our ability to engage all of the different challenges that we're facing every day it's almost like magic. Clients say it's like magically I feel more clear, more confident, more composed to be able to make great decisions, to be able to respond effectively, and to create an environment that brings out the best in others.
Yeah. And that is exactly what we are going to be laying out here on this podcast over the next several weeks, right? We are going to teach people the exact tools to upgrade their operating system. We're going to keep them really short for you because we know that everybody is super busy. So follow along here for the next several weeks as we teach every single tool in the leadership operating system and really dig into how do we tackle some of these leadership challenges that we so commonly face.